I think happiness is not a smiling face, it's more a smiling soul. But why do we find it confusing? Why is it hard to understand? I think Taoism offers a really good analogy here. So imagine life as like a dense, thorny forest. And in the middle of this forest is a well-paved superhighway. And it's easy to walk along that path. But there are other paths. But these paths go through swamps, they go through thorns, they go up and down hills, and they are difficult. And I think happiness is a little bit like that. There's certain paths to happiness which feel right and are right, but there are so many different paths with their different sirens' calls which attract us. So if we imagine happiness as being on the right path, if we follow the Taoist metaphor, then the question we've got to ask ourselves is, if we are unhappy, what's going on there? And the question then is about finding the right path again. There are certain lights which emerge in the history of philosophy and theology as well, which are meant to act as beacons or guides with which we can walk towards. It's found in Confucius's idea of right virtue, it's found in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and it's found in Al-Ghazali's idea that the right way is in accordance with Allah. So if we are unhappy, then we should work towards these lights. And I've identified 3 lights, or what that's called pillars of happiness. The first pillar, or light number 1, is the idea that happiness is not measured by pleasure. So the ancient Greeks had a lot of different words for happiness, and one of them is hedonia. It's quite easy to measure and it's quite easy to understand because it's an emotional affect. Eudaimonia, though, is a much harder word to understand. It's often translated as flourishing, and the reason why it's difficult to understand is that it's often understood in reverse. So there are many moments in life where we look back on our experiences and think they were really hard at the time, but actually we were supremely happy. For example, raising young kids or even school can be quite hard at the time, but we look back and think those were moments where I was deeply, supremely happy. So the idea that pleasure is not an essential ingredient to happiness appears in many different philosophical schools. So this idea is central to Buddhism. So Buddhists tend to define pleasure as being a desire satisfied. So I want a drink of water, and so I reach for the water and I drink it, and that gives me a pleasure. But the problem, of course, is that this is an unwinnable game. Every day we have millions and millions of desires, and there's no way we can satisfy them. If we're to be happy at all, it has to be found outside of this notion of pleasure. We have to step beyond hedonia. But the problem is that we risk going too far. It's a logical fallacy to say that just because pleasure doesn't equal happiness, that suffering therefore must. But of course, that's not true. And the second pillar, the second light which emerges across all these traditions is moderation. That we have to find a middle way. It's essential to Taoism. And the idea is that life is not black or white, but rather it's a confused and confusing cocktail of things. Everything is grey. So yin tends to represent the dark, the mysterious, the elusive, water, fluidity. And yang tends to represent the exciting, the passionate, the loud, the sunny, and truth. And so for Taoists, we have to find the middle path, which is walking between yin and yang. But this idea of moderation is also seen in everyday life, and it's in the Swedish lifestyle concept of lagom, which means just the right amount. And there's 2 elements to it, really. The first element is a kind of fair usage policy, where if I take all of the cookies in the cookie jar, then it leaves none for anybody else. And so what I do will affect other people. The second element of lagom is a kind of recognition that sometimes less really is more. And so, for example, if I'm having a coffee with a friend, that's fun, that's enjoyable. But if I have 7 coffees, it's not so much. But the third thing that I noticed appearing is the idea that happiness is an unavoidable emergent state of goodness. That you cannot be truly and meaningfully happy unless you are also virtuous. But of course, this raises a problem, and the problem is, what does virtuous mean? Because if we zoom in on any different culture and any different time, what people define as right and wrong and good and bad will change from person to person, from philosopher to philosopher. So if you look at the history of philosophy, what you find is that certain virtues have always been called virtues and certain vices have always been called vices. I think we can identify 5. The first is altruism and the vice egoism. So this is seen in Augustine's Code for Monks, and it's seen in Islam's Zakat. It's there in Peter Singer and Immanuel Kant and Thomas Aquinas. And the idea is a sense of other-regardedness, charity, and caring for other people. So the second is kindness and cruelty. So this is best represented by the golden mean, which most people are familiar with this from the Gospels, which is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But it's not just in the Gospels. It's seen in Sanskrit, in Tamil, in Persian, in ancient Greece, and in the Vedas. But it's also seen in modern times in Kant's first categorical imperative and in Aquinas' natural law. Be good and kind to other people. And the third virtue vice is justice and injustice.
There's the very simple-sounding approach advanced by 20th century American political philosopher John Rawls. He argued that justice is fairness. Any inequalities that exist in a social system, Rawls said, should favor the least well-off, because this levels the playing field of society.
The fourth virtue vice is wisdom and ignorance. Socrates famously wrote that the unexamined life is not worth living, and the Buddha encouraged his disciples to meditate at great length on the universe. And the fifth virtue vice is humility and arrogance. And I think this has 2 strands, really. The first is a kind of intellectual humility, which is represented best by John Stuart Mill. And the second is a kind of existential humility, which is represented by the religions. It's in Karl Barth, it's in Maimonides, and the word Islam literally translates as surrender to Allah. This is the idea that you are not the center of the universe. There are things outside of your understanding which are far more powerful and which we occasionally have to bow to. What Plato's advice is that we have to try to seek the soul behind the body. We have to see the mind behind the eyes. And to do that, we have to be with them, and we have to ask important questions, and we have to both want the same thing. And so Plato would argue that love is not blind, but the opposite, in fact. Love is piercingly insightful. Love sees behind the cracked smiles and the wrinkles and the fake laughs, and it sees the person there. So taking all these together, how can we actually apply these three pillars to our day-to-day life? And I think for pillar number one, which is the idea that happiness cannot be measured by pleasure, I think a really good example of this is parenting. And I think parenting is an example of looking back at a stage of your life and thinking all of the ingredients might have been pretty hard in themselves. But as a whole, I was deeply existentially happy. Pillar number two is the idea of moderation in all things. And I think this is best seen in dieting. So most diets end within a month, or if not weeks. And the best diets in history allow a degree of flexibility and moderation. So dieting, when it's done at these extremes, does work for some people, no doubt. But for most people, dieting is best when it happens in the middle way. So pillar number three is that happiness requires goodness. Those who are kind and those who are friendly will have friends, and those who have friends are also happy. If you feel you are unhappy in life, you can look at these pillars and think, which of these three am I not meeting? Is it that I'm confusing a hard patch of my life with being unhappy? Is it that I'm going to two extremes? Or is it that possibly I'm not being as good as I could be? If we recognize that those are the problems in our life, we can take steps to fix it.
As Kant puts it, happiness is an absolute whole. It's maximum welfare in my present and every possible future condition. Happiness isn't meant to be about distress and dissatisfaction. Kant concludes that we would be mistaken to pursue happiness per se. Instead, all of the things that we think give us happiness we should see as guidelines or as advisings. We can try to get richer, healthier or smarter or whatever, but we'd be wrong to think that they give us happiness, because the very notion of happiness is an ideal of the imagination only. For Kant, happiness exists only in the mind, yet is peculiarly absent when we thirst or hunger for it. Happiness is something we often only appreciate in hindsight, and it often looks very different to what we thought it would be.